Our family history and excerpts of my cousin Paul's speech to the Sons of Italy in Tacoma back in 2016. In Gig Harbor, we have a wonderful museum, the Harbor History Museum, and 3 years ago, they asked Paul and I if we could explain to the people that would come to the museum the story of our 4 Italian families that settled in Gig Harbor. Now, our cousin, Greg Spadoni, has done research and has learned that before we came, there were other Italians that came temporarily to Gig Harbor, but they did not settle and stay for the 50 years that we have, or actually 100 years now. So, the Italians in Gig Harbor, this was part of a feature at the museum called Our Town, and so they focused on Italy for this talk. Go. This is my father, Roy Spadoni. He was the son of Michael Spadoni, called Michele in Italy. And this is our grandfather and his wife, Anita Marie Segari. My husband, Frank, will be sharing our visual presentation. This is our family chart showing Michele and Anita's parents, Pietro Spadoni, Maria Marchi, Torello Segari, and Inez Capopi. The Italians that first immigrated to Gig Harbor came from what is loosely labeled now as Tuscany, Italy, the land of the ancient Etruscans. Specifically, they came from small hill towns near Lucca, Italy, Montecatini, and Monte Carlo. And our cousin Paul is going to explain further about his research into the Italian families and where they're located. The major ports for immigration would have been Genoa and Livorno, Italy. Paul in his speech wrote, "The American dream, your parents, grandparents, or maybe it was your great-grandparents, came from Italy for the American dream. They loved the old country. They were proud to be Italian, but they were ambitious and they were dirt poor, literally because most of them owned no dirt. My grandfather was a tenant farmer, like many of your ancestors, most of whom were barely able to survive by working someone else's land. And my Irish ancestors can tell the same story. And so they came by the millions, 3 million between 1900 and 1915. Dovete andare all'America, they were told. There you will have opportunity. In America, the streets are paved with gold. According to Paul's research, during 100 years, an estimated 25 million Italians immigrated from Italy. The Italian diaspora is the large-scale migration of Italians away from Italy in the period between the unification of Italy in 1861 and the rise of fascism during the 1920s. It's estimated just in this time that some 9 million Italians left just during this period, most from northern Italy and most going to either North or South America. Poverty as a result of the ending of the feudal land system led to this migration. When word came back to Italy that there was work and the support of families in America, it fostered immigration. And thus, 4 families came to settle in Gig Harbor. The family names now represent hundreds of descendants, and thank you for all coming. Spadoni, Segari, Natucci, Donati. I might interject that as recent as the 1950s, the eastern Italian border between Italy and Croatia, Yugoslavia changed, and Gig Harbor names like Terabocha and Kozlic have both Croatian and Italian heritage. My grandfather, Michele, came in 1902 from Toscana in a little community between Lucca and Firenze, Florence, Italy. Paul will be showing more detail of this small town. The ship's log lists his occupation as peasant. He found opportunity in America, yes. Streets of gold, not any. Paul quoted Michael saying, "I found out 3 things right away. First, the streets aren't paved with gold. Second, the streets aren't paved at all. And third, they expected me to pave the streets." Michael took a job as a cook on a train crew that went across the country repairing tracks. He had no experience as a chef, but he was Italian, and everybody knows that Italians are the best cooks in the world, so he got the job. It's a common immigrant story following the train routes west to look for work. The train came to Washington State, and he heard about a brick factory that was opening near Eatonville, Washington. Michael had experience working in a brick factory in Italy, and so he quit the railroad and took a job in Clay City. And our cousin Paul researched the location of this factory, and although it is long gone, he went there and actually recovered some bricks. 5 years after Michael came to America, he was a supervisor, and he had enough money to return to Italy and ask Annette Spadoni to marry him. She was from a wealthier family, but she knew that Michael was hardworking and intelligent, and she accepted his proposal. A year later, they returned to Clay City, and this time, Michele's listed occupation had been upgraded to engineer. Clay City was a factory town with only one other Italian family at the time, and Annette was homesick for Italy. She returned to visit her parents and friends while she was pregnant with their 3rd daughter. Whether it was just for a visit or she planned to stay in Italy is not known, but we do know that she hoped for Michael to return with her. But while there, she looked at the rampant poverty in 1912 still infecting the country. She thought deeply about the family's future in Italy. How would Michael find work? Where would they live? What kind of future would their children have? Torn with conflict, she sent a telegram to Michael. "Dearest husband, you and I belong in Italy, but for our children, there is no future for them in Italy. I will be on the next ship back to America." She returned, now with 3 children instead of 2. It's likely that Annette Spadoni's brother, Ruggiero, known as Roger, also came to Clay City at this time to work because records show that his first daughter was born there. I have a hard time repeating this story, thinking about the risks our grandparents took and the sacrifices they made to give their children and grandchildren a better life. Speaking only Italian at first, but determined to commit to their new country, they encouraged speaking of English at home. Michele and Annette eventually did adapt to their new country, and they and their 7 children all realized the American dream. Michael found employment at the Tacoma ore smelter and moved his family first to Tacoma and then in 1914 to Gig Harbor. They bought land in Shore Acres on Reed Drive, building first a very small house, we would call it a cabin now, and later a larger home as the family grew. After the 3 girls, 4 boys were born. Shore Acres was only 1 mile from Gig Harbor, but was dense woods with rough dirt roads and very few homes. Michael is shown here in later life on the Shore Acres property. The 7 children walked to be educated at Midway School, which has now been moved on the grounds of the Harbor History Museum. It was a 1-room school for elementary grades. They graduated from Gig Harbor Union High School and they began working, marrying, and they all settled in Gig Harbor. This is the big house. The Spadoni home was common for families to build their own homes with helps from relatives living nearby, and Annette's brother Roger had purchased adjacent property. Later on, the Spadonis even built their own tennis court next to the house, protecting the windows from errant tennis balls with heavy screen. The 3 daughters were named Nelda, Clara, and Lola. I have portraits of them as young adults. Nelda married James Langhelm and their children Maureen, Jim, Gerald, and David. Nelda cooked school lunches, first at the two-room Rosedale School and then at the first Harbor Heights Elementary School, located where Gig Harbor City Hall now stands. Like her mother, Anita, she died too young of cancer. I think that it is her biscotti recipe that you will be tasting today. Clara was employed with the Internal Revenue Income Tax Audit Department and then bookkeeper for Spadoni Brothers business. She spearheaded the restoration of the old St. Nicholas Church in the 1980s, and the Gig Harbor Peninsula Historical Society honored her with a lifetime membership for her efforts in preserving the historical church. Clara and her husband Harvey McCabe began a family tradition of 4th of July celebrations with picnic and boating at their beach home in Rosedale, which became an annual tradition, rain or shine, and you'll see pictures on our photo table from there. Clara and Harvey had Richard, Gary, and Anita. Lola married Ed Elford, and they had 2 daughters, Patricia, Mays, and Darlene. Lola met her husband while working at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, and they built their home in Rosedale on Spadoni Hill overlooking Lay Inlet. Lola loved gardening and in later years became a certified master gardener. She was a naturalist who had a passion for beachcombing and collected shell and seaweed specimens on camping trips from Canada to Mexico, many times taking her nieces along. I was very fortunate to be on one of her trips. She cataloged her collection scientifically and traded shells with other collectors worldwide. She was an early member of the Pacific Northwest Shell Club, and oceanographers at the University of Washington once asked her to help identify seaweed in the San Juan Islands. Lola was also an accomplished seamstress, sewing everything from doll clothes, wedding dresses, to upholstery. When her brothers married and began having children, Lola began the family tradition of Christmas breakfast at her home, and by the late 1990s would host as many as 80 family members and acquaintances dropping in for coffee and waffles. This is an early picture showing spouses and dates at the big house. Now we're going to talk about the boys. Julius began working after high school by logging and fishing. From 1937 to 39, he worked for Washington, Oregon Plywood, and during World War II, he was employed at the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. He was best known by local residents as co-owner of Spadoni Brothers, Inc., established in 1946, and he was the decision maker for the business. Julius is remembered as a person who cared about others quietly, and at his funeral, the priest recalled that with his slow, quiet wisdom, he gave better sermons than I do. Julius married Margaret Wagoner, and they had Linda, Roger, and Paul. Roy, my dad, was born at home in Shore Acres, the doctor coming to the house in those days. He was a good-natured, generous man whose greatest joy was the love he shared with his wife and 7 children. He had a natural mechanical ability, and while serving in World War II in Europe with the 10th Armored Division, he drove his own Jeep made of scrapped Jeep parts, not the usual transportation for only a tech sergeant. Later in life, he would collect vintage engines, build his own sawmill, cutting lumber for family and the business. He restored a World War II Jeep, and he would maintain the machinery of Spadoni Brothers' rapidly growing business. He was always helping someone. Don Gillich, a local fisherman, once called my dad on Friday evening to ask for help with his fishing boat diesel engine. Dad pulled out the engine, accomplished the repairs, and had the engine back in the boat so that Don could resume the fishing season. Dad loved education and often helped us with our school projects. In his memory, high school scholarships are given each year. Roy married Teresa Bannon, and they had 7 children: Annette, Larry, Kathy, Julie, John, Susan, and Sharon. And he loved his sawmill. Go back. He'd start it with a can of ether sometimes when it wouldn't roll over. So we all got some of his wood. Now I'm going to talk about Claude. Claude.
One more.
Claude, called Mike, never married and lived in the family home throughout his life. Although remembered as being shy, he was also kind, caring, and big on family tradition. He hosted the Christmas Eve family gathering for 55 years. He enjoyed the annual pheasant hunting trips to eastern Washington with his brothers, cousins, and uncles. Claude played the harmonica and usually had one in his pocket, along with the ever-present red bandana handkerchief. Claude would be seen to work driving the weighted roller machine to carefully smooth the asphalt pavement laid. Throughout his life, he always had a sailboat, and one of his earliest wood-hulled boats, named Miss Tipsy, now hangs in the lobby of the Best Western Wesley Inn in Gig Harbor. Rudy Spadoni, Rudolph or Rudolfo. He married Jacqueline Milliken and they had 7 children, Michael, Peter, Colleen, Tina, Judy, and Leonard. After graduating, Tina. After graduating from high school, Rudy went to welding school and then worked in the shipyard welding. Flying airplanes was his first love, and unable to qualify for the Air Force in World War II, he enlisted in the combat engineers and served in Europe. With his brothers, he built the operation that started as clearing land and building roads into a prosperous business, Spadoni Brothers. In later years, he was happy to fly his own planes, a 2-seater Cessna and a 4-seater Mooney. He died pursuing his favorite hobby, flying, following a plane crash at a private airstrip. This is an old picture of Spadoni Brothers building, which still remains on the corner of Stinson and Pioneer, Rosedale Street. This second look at Spadoni Brothers business depicts, you're showing some other, that's fine, some old pictures of Spadoni Brothers and early chainsaws, clearing. This second look at Spadoni Brothers business depicts a fundraising car wash held at Spadoni Brothers site, one of many that occurred there over the years at no cost to the fundraising organizations. This artwork is by Bruce Smith, a local resident. Over the 50 years in business, Spadoni Brothers grew in scope of operations, beginning with land clearing and logging for homes and farms and roads. The brothers added an asphalt plant in Crescent Valley, and as it turned out, the Spadoni Brothers did pave many of the streets in Gig Harbor, even though it was with asphalt and not gold. They also did land development, moving dirt to develop what would become Copachuck State Park, Murphy's Landing, Scansey Marina, and early Canterwood housing development, among others, throughout Pierce County. Now I want to tell you about Anita Segeri's sibling, 3 of which also came to live in Gig Harbor. 2 sisters, Lena and Paul Helby Iole, were born before Anita and remained in Italy with their parents, Torello Segeri and Inez Capocci. A family artifact is a music diploma earned in 1889 by Torello in Palermo, Italy, and it's on our photo table. The 6 children are shown in this portrait. There are 2 sisters not identified. Roger Segeri is in the back row center, and Segero Segeri, we knew him as Uncle Jim, is seated front row right. Ruggiero Roger also worked at the brick factory in Clay City. He married Mary Natucci and had 2 daughters, Dolores and Alma. This shows the relationship with the other Italian families. After moving to Gig Harbor and purchasing land, Roger built at least 3 homes in Shore Acres before his death. Family recollections are that he carried on his father's musical talents. Seguero with wife Leona. Keep going. There. Seguero with his wife Leona Donati. He was Uncle Jim to me, and he arrived in America at age 16 on 1909. He first lived in San Francisco and came to Washington to live in Bremerton. He served in World War I and then began working at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. He settled in Gig Harbor and, probably with his brother, also built at least 3 different homes in Shore Acres. He married Leona in Bellingham, and their daughters were Ethylee and Lita. And I learned today that there was a son that died shortly after birth. Ethylee married George Anchich, and they had 4 children: Lenita, Lenny, Maria, Lita Dawn, and Paul. Lita married Rodney Wagner, and they had Brent, Kurt, Scott, who's here, and Pamela. Leona Segeri Donati's family first emigrated to South America before coming to the United States and then to Washington. Leona's father was born in South America, returned to Italy where he married, and the first 2 of his children were born. After immigrating to the U.S., their 3rd child, Leo Donati, was born in Black Diamond, Washington, and we have descendants of Leo here. Dorinda and her brother Dennis. Keep going, Denny. There on the right. Often we would remember Leona because she would be up at 4 a.m. mixing up large batches of yeasty dough we called noni bread to bake and deliver to families in the neighborhood later in the day. Other Spadonis coming to Gig Harbor were nephews of Michael Spadoni. This is Adolph. He came to Gig Harbor by way of Clay City also, leaving 3 brothers and 3 sisters in Italy. After serving in the U.S. Army in World War I, he worked in Bremerton and at the Naval Shipyard there. His sons were Roland and Donald. Roland, an avid skier and tennis player until his late 80s, worked as a production superintendent at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Bremerton. He recalled his young childhood as his father built his house that's still on Soundview Drive, and he walked to Midway School, sometimes carrying his gun so he could do hunting on the way home. And he is given a wonderful video memorabilia of his time at Midway School, which is at the museum. Adolph's brother Alfred Spadoni, who married Renata Donati, younger sister of Leona Donati Segeri, spent his early years in Kent, Washington. Son Alfred Al was a World War II vet serving in the Philippines and occupied Japan. After the war, he became a machinist at the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, later working in the machinery section of the design division. He was a talented woodworker, giving away most of the items he crafted. Al also was a featured historian for the Harbor History Museum, recording his recollections of school life attending the Midway School, along with his cousin Roland. Dr. Leon Spadoni would become a noted OBGYN at the University of Washington School of Medicine in Seattle, specializing in infertility. Dr. Leon loved the game of golf and was proud of the 29 tournaments that he won, as well as the 7 holes-in-one he achieved. Ronald spent his adult life in Arizona, married with children. Are you starting to recognize the name connections? Spadoni, Segeri, Natusi, Donati? I better tie up the Donati connections. The brother to Leona Donati Segeri and Renata Donati Spadoni was Leo Donati. He became a Marysville High School principal, married and lived much of his life in Gig Harbor. Oh wait, have I neglected to mention the Natushi families? Rosina Sagari, the youngest Sagari child, married Bijou Remigio, called Ray Natucci. Together, they built and ran the Shore Acres store located on Soundview Drive. Originally, Soundview was the only road from the car ferry to Bremerton prior to the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. The store provided canned goods and staples, ice cream and gasoline from a hand-operated gas pump. Following the sudden death of her husband and raising two small daughters, Lorraine and Beverly, a young nephew, Marvin Natucci, one of 6 children, came from Tacoma to live with Rosina to help her with the house and the store. Marvin, the same age as the Spadoni boys down the road, soon was running through the woods to go down to spend time with them and became especially close to my dad, Roy. He became a significant contributor to the Roy Spadoni Scholarship Foundation in his memory. In later life, Marvin would say that World War II had the greatest impact on his life, working 7 days a week for 7 weeks without a day off, working as a welder at the Naval Shipyard. Marvin went on to marry and own his own business in Gig Harbor, Natucci Heating and Appliance, and also was a commercial fisherman and was a pilot flying his own plane. Marvin had nieces and nephews that settled in the Tacoma and Gig Harbor area. In preparing for this presentation, I reviewed our genealogy begun soon after my marriage 50 years ago, when my husband asked after one Christmas, "Just how are you related to the Ansich family?" We got out a roll of wrapping paper, and about 12 feet later, we had it roughly drawn out. Almost done. Frank's Family Tree Maker program now lists 128 people carrying the Spadoni name alone. My cousin Paul is the ultimate genealogist in the family. After retiring from an award-winning career teaching journalism, he now spends a portion of each year living in Italy, learning Italian, and establishing roots in the town of our Sagari grandmother's birth. He has been writing memoirs of his varied Italian adventures in a blog on the internet. You can read his blog, and he'll be telling you about that too, living with abroad in Tuscany. In the last 100 years, our Italian families emigrated, found work, became citizens, learned English, and educated their children, all graduating high school. Those children had children, many achieving college educations and professions of doctor, dentist, engineer, CPA, attorney, biologist, artists, nurses, and many teachers, to name a few. The Spadoni and connecting names have had an impact in the Gig Harbor area in many ways. Philanthropy and high school scholarships, assisting the Gig Harbor Rotary and being recognized with the Paul Harris Award, maintaining the Artendale Cemetery where many ancestors are buried, preserving the historic St. Nicholas Church, and providing the first home for the Historical Society. Dawn Ansich Stanton, our cousin, has been active in the historic preservation of Gig Harbor, including the net sheds, and currently her artistic presence in large public murals as well as her art drawings are displayed around town. We've had members on the board of directors of Gig Harbor organizations. I want to thank you for coming to our first big reunion, and enjoy the Italian biscotti, but remember, our family would never dip it in chocolate.